The sun rose slowly over the small Pacific island, casting a pale golden light over the rough terrain and the scattered palms that swayed gently in the early morning breeze. The U.S. Marines stirred in their positions, still feeling the fatigue of the long journey across the ocean and the months of preparation that had brought them to this remote piece of land. They moved quietly among the foxholes and sandbags, checking their weapons and communicating in low voices, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy even though the tension in the air was palpable. The island was quiet except for the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore and the occasional cry of a seabird that circled high above the dense foliage. Lieutenant James Harrison walked along the narrow path that led between the trenches, his boots crunching against the coarse sand and gravel. He paused occasionally to peer through the binoculars at the dense jungle beyond the perimeter. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that shifted in the undergrowth made his heart beat a little faster. He knew that the Japanese forces were moving closer and that the next few hours could determine the fate of his men. He thought about the letters he had written to his family the night before the departure, about the small, mundane details of home, and wondered if he would ever see them again. The men of his unit were a mix of young and old, some barely 20 and others hardened veterans of previous battles. They moved with a combination of nervous energy and disciplined routine, checking ammunition, distributing rations, and helping each other reinforce the defenses. The engineers worked tirelessly to strengthen the sandbag walls and dig deeper trenches, while the radio operators tried repeatedly to establish contact with the command ships offshore. Their voices were low but tense, and every command was given with a sense of urgency that betrayed the calm exterior they tried to maintain. Private Daniel Moore sat in his foxhole staring at the horizon. He had grown up in a small town in the Midwest and had never imagined that he would find himself on this tiny island thousands of miles from home, fighting a war that seemed almost abstract. Before the journey began, he held his rifle tightly and listened to the faint sounds of movement in the jungle. His mind raced with memories of home. The smell of his mother's cooking, the laughter of his younger sister, and the quiet evenings spent reading by the fire. He knew that those memories were distant now, and that survival depended on focus and preparation. The landscape of the island was both beautiful and treacherous. The terrain was rocky and uneven, with patches of dense jungle that provided both cover and danger. The undergrowth was thick and tangled, making movement difficult and slow. The Marines had learned quickly that every step had to be calculated and that even the smallest mistake could expose them to enemy fire. The humidity was heavy and oppressive, and sweat ran down their faces and backs as they worked tirelessly to fortify their positions. Despite the discomfort and danger, there was a sense of determination that ran through the men, a shared understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves. Captain Robert Jenkins moved among the men, offering words of encouragement and instruction. He checked on the placement of machine guns, the readiness of the mortars, and the organization of the patrols. Each decision was made with careful consideration of both the immediate threat and the larger strategic picture. He knew that the Japanese forces were skilled and relentless, and that underestimating them could have catastrophic consequences. He reminded himself constantly that discipline and unity would be their greatest weapons in the coming fight. As the morning wore on, the tension on the island seemed to thicken. The sound of distant explosions from other parts of the Pacific served as a reminder that the war was never far away. The men ate quickly from their rations, knowing that the real challenge lay ahead. The sun climbed higher and the heat intensified, adding another layer of strain to their already exhausted bodies. They wiped their faces and adjusted their helmets, checking their weapons one last time before the inevitable confrontation. In the shade of a large tree, a group of Marines gathered to discuss strategy and share information about sightings of enemy movements. Lieutenant Harrison listened carefully to their reports, noting the locations of tracks, footprints, and broken branches. He drew mental maps of the potential approaches the enemy might use and formulated contingencies for each possibility he shared. His observations with the other officers, and together they coordinated a plan that would maximize their defensive capabilities despite the overwhelming odds. The jungle itself seemed alive with anticipation. The leaves rustled as unseen creatures moved through the undergrowth. The wind carried distant sounds that could have been birds or could have been enemy scouts. The men strained their senses, trying to distinguish between harmless movements and the signals of approaching danger. Every shadow and every noise was analyzed and discussed as they prepared for the day that would test their courage and resolve to the limit. Even in the midst of preparation, there were moments of quiet reflection. The men thought about the lives they had left behind and the futures that were uncertain. The letters from home were read and reread, silently offering comfort and motivation. They shared stories in hushed tones about childhood memories, past battles and dreams of returning to normal life. These brief moments of humanity reminded them of what they were fighting for and strengthened their determination to hold the line. As afternoon approached, the sun dipped lower and the heat began to wane slightly, but the tension on the island did not abate. The Marines continued to patrol the perimeter and reinforce their positions. Each step was measured and deliberate. Each glance into the dense jungle carried the weight of anticipation. The men were aware that the Japanese forces were advancing steadily, and that soon there would be no turning back. The preparations that had taken hours and days were all they could rely on in the face of the looming threat. Lieutenant Harrison took a moment to stand on a small rise and observe the layout of the island. The beaches stretched out to the east, and the jungle pressed in from the west. The rocky outcrops offered some natural defense, but the terrain also posed significant challenges. He traced the paths that the enemy might take and calculated the distances the Marines would need to cover to respond effectively. His mind was a constant calculation of risk and opportunity, balancing hope and fear in equal measure. The Marines continued their work as the shadows lengthened. They moved with a careful efficiency that came from both training and necessity. Every man knew his role, and every action was part of a coordinated effort to survive. The sound of hammering wood, the thud of sandbags being moved, and the occasional shouted instruction created a rhythm that matched the beating of anxious hearts. By the time the sun began to touch the horizon with a faint red glow, the Marines were ready for the night ahead. The trenches were deep, the barricades solid, and the men positioned strategically to maximize their defensive advantage. Lieutenant Harrison and Captain Jenkins gathered the men, briefly offering words of encouragement and reminding them of their duty and their courage. The men nodded silently, aware that the real test would come after darkness fell, and that the battle ahead would challenge every ounce of their strength and resolve. As twilight descended, the island seemed to hold its breath. The wind carried a faint scent of the sea mixed with the earthy aroma of the jungle. The men settled into their positions, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the shadows. The hours before the inevitable confrontation stretched long and tense. Each Marine was aware that the coming night could change everything, and that the outcome would depend on their courage, discipline, and unity. Even in the quiet moments, there was a sense of anticipation that vibrated through the air. The Marines knew that the Japanese forces were near, and that the night would bring the storm of battle. The preparations had been meticulous, and the courage of the men steadfast, but no plan could fully anticipate the chaos and intensity that awaited them. The island itself seemed to wait silently for the clash that was about to erupt. Lieutenant Harrison took a deep breath and focused on the men around him. Their faces reflected the determination and fear that he felt himself. They were ready in ways that went beyond tactics and weapons. They were ready in spirit, prepared to face what was to come with courage and resolve. They were the U.S. Marines, and this was their stand on the small island far from home. As the last light of day faded into the thick blanket of night, the island grew quiet, in a deceptive calm. The men of the U.S. Marines remained alert in their foxholes and behind sandbag barricades, every sense heightened by the knowledge that the Japanese forces were closing in. The jungle that had seemed peaceful during the day now became a maze of shadows and indistinct shapes, every movement potentially signaling danger or death. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of salt water and earth and the occasional rustle of leaves that made the men tighten their grips on their rifles. Lieutenant Harrison moved silently along the line, checking each position, stopping briefly to whisper encouragement or adjust the placement of a weapon. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, knowing that the lives of hundreds of men depended on his decisions. The patrols had returned, reporting sightings of distant movement, the sound of low voices, and the occasional flash of a fire or light signaling the enemy. Approach. He marked each report, mentally calculating the most likely points of attack and directing the men to reinforce those areas with precision and care. The Japanese forces moved with the quiet discipline of trained soldiers. Their approach, almost imperceptible through the dense undergrowth and rugged terrain. Their strategy was to encircle the Marines, cutting off escape routes and isolating positions systematically. They advanced in small groups, taking care not to disturb the natural environment too much, but every step brought them closer to the line of defense the Marines had so carefully established. The island seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if it knew that a violent storm was about to descend upon it. Private Daniel Moore crouched in his trench, listening intently to the faint sounds that drifted through the night. The rustle of leaves, snapping twigs, and distant murmurs all hinted at the presence of enemy soldiers. He felt the tension building in his chest, the familiar tightness that came before a battle. The memories of home, the laughter of friends and family, and the quiet of peaceful days now seemed like distant dreams. The only reality that mattered was the survival of himself and the men around him, the need to hold the line against a force that outnumbered them and to endure the night that lay ahead. Captain Jenkins coordinated with his lieutenants, marking positions on improvised maps and relaying instructions to squads that would need to respond instantly. The lines of communication were strained by distance and terrain, but every effort was made to ensure that no position would be left vulnerable. He moved among the men, checking on ammunition supply, the readiness of mortars and machine guns, and the placement of traps and obstacles designed to slow the enemy advance. The men followed his instructions with disciplined precision, knowing that every detail could mean the difference between life and death. The shadows of the jungle seemed to shift with life of their own. The men strained their eyes in the darkness, trying to distinguish between harmless movements and the stealthy advance of Japanese soldiers. Every sound was analyzed and every shadow studied, as if the island itself were a living map of potential threats. The men whispered in low tones, sharing observations and warnings, each detail contributing to the larger picture of the impending attack. As night deepened, the tension became almost unbearable. The Marines worked tirelessly, reinforcing their positions, setting tripwires and preparing explosives for strategic points. The engineers moved quietly and efficiently, their hands steady despite the pounding of their hearts. The soldiers checked and rechecked their weapons, loaded extra ammunition, and shared whispered words of encouragement and reassurance. Each man understood the gravity of the situation and the stakes that had never been higher. The Japanese forces continued their encirclement, slowly and methodically moving through the darkness and undergrowth. Their discipline was evident in the silence with which they advanced, and the careful coordination that ensured that no position was left unobserved. They relied on intelligence, gathered from scouts and local sources, and moved in patterns designed to isolate and overwhelm the Marines. Once the first strike came, it would be a coordinated and devastating assault aimed at crushing the defenders in a single night. Lieutenant Harrison took a moment to observe the horizon. The dark outline of the jungle contrasted against the night sky. He imagined the enemy moving silently among the trees, their eyes searching for the lines of defense, their ears attuned to any sound that might betray the presence of the Marines. He knew that the coming hours would test not only their physical endurance, but their mental fortitude. Every decision would have consequences, and every action could determine the outcome of the battle. Private Moore checked his rifle once again, making sure it was clean and ready. He adjusted the strap over his shoulder and listened to the whispers of his comrades as they prepared for the fight. He could feel the sweat on his brow and the tension in his muscles, his body alert and ready for the sudden burst of violence that he knew would come without warning. He thought briefly of the letters he had written to his family and the hope that somehow he would survive the night and see them again. Sound of distant footsteps and muffled voices sent waves of adrenaline through the Marines, every man instinctively scanning the shadows for movement. The anticipation was suffocating each second, stretching longer than the last as the enemy closed in. They could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the snapping of small branches, and the soft murmur of voices that carried through the darkness like a warning. The men held their positions, silently waiting for the first sign of the attack. Captain Jenkins coordinated the placement of flares and signaling devices, knowing that light would be both a warning and a weapon. He reminded the squads of fallback positions and escape routes within the defensive perimeter. Every man memorized the layout of the trenches and obstacles, each aware that quick thinking and precise action would be required to survive. The officers spoke in low, deliberate tones, conveying strategy and morale, their calm presence helping to steady the nerves of the younger soldiers. The Japanese forces tested the perimeter, sending small probes to gauge the strength and reaction of the Marines. They encountered resistance at several points and fell back only to regroup and approach again from different angles. The Marines responded with disciplined accuracy, using machine guns, rifles, and mortars to repel the probes and gather intelligence about the enemy's strength and tactics. Each encounter heightened the tension and the urgency of preparation as the true magnitude of the attack became clear. In the darkness of the night, the men took brief moments to glance at each other, their faces tense and serious but resolute. They offered silent nods and quiet words of encouragement, acknowledging the shared burden of the coming battle. The camaraderie that had developed over weeks and months of training and deployment now became a source of strength and courage. Every man knew that survival depended not just on skill, but on trust in the men beside him. The island seemed to hold its breath as the hours passed. The wind shifted occasionally, carrying new sounds that kept the men alert. The rustling of leaves, the distant splash of water, and the low moan of the night wind all became part of the symphony of anticipation. Every detail mattered, and every observation contributed to the preparation for the onslaught that was inevitable. Lieutenant Harrison moved along the line one last time, checking the readiness of each position and reassuring the men he observed. The young soldiers gripping their weapons tightly, their eyes wide with focus and determination. He knew that fear was natural, but courage and training would carry them through the night. He reminded himself that every man here had been chosen for a reason, and that together they had the ability to withstand even the most overwhelming force. Private Moore crouched in the darkness, feeling the tension building in his chest. His mind replayed scenarios of the enemy attack, the sound of gunfire, the explosions, and the rush of soldiers through the trenches. He focused on his breathing and the feel of his rifle in his hands, knowing that concentration and presence of mind would be his greatest allies. The night stretched long before him, and every second brought them closer to the inevitable confrontation. As midnight approached, the sounds of the approaching Japanese forces grew clearer. The Marines could hear the subtle movements of troops navigating the jungle, the faint clatter of equipment, and the occasional low voice communicating instructions. Their positions were now fully surrounded, and the sense of encirclement pressed in on them from every direction. The men adjusted their positions, tightened their grips, and steeled themselves for the first clash that would mark the beginning of a night of battle that none would forget. Every Marine knew that there was no room for hesitation. The Japanese forces were relentless and highly trained, and the slightest mistake could be fatal. The officers continued to coordinate movements silently and efficiently, their calm presence guiding the men as they waited for the inevitable storm of violence to descend. The island was alive with tension, every shadow and every sound, a potential signal of the attack to come. Lieutenant Harrison stood at a vantage point surveying the perimeter, his mind calculating the possible strategies and outcomes. Each movement of the enemy, each sound in the darkness, was catalogued and analyzed. In his mind, he felt the weight of command pressing on his shoulders, but also the resolve and courage of the men around him that gave him strength. He knew that the night ahead would demand every ounce of skill, discipline, and bravery they possessed, and so they waited in the darkness, surrounded on all sides by forces that outnumbered them, their hearts pounding in anticipation, their bodies tense and ready for the first sign of the enemy advance. Each man clung to his training and his determination, knowing that the survival of the unit depended on their collective courage and focus. The island seemed to shrink under the weight of the impending clash, and the night itself seemed to stretch endlessly as the Marines prepared to defend their position at all costs. The darkness of the night was shattered suddenly by the roar of gunfire and the thunder of explosions. The Japanese forces had launched their attack in waves, moving with deadly precision through the jungle and across the rocky terrain. The Marines responded instantly, opening fire from their fortified positions, their rifles and machine guns cutting through the shadows with disciplined accuracy. The air was filled with the staccato rhythm of bullets, the cracking of wood, and the distant blasts of mortars as both sides clashed in a brutal dance of survival. Lieutenant Harrison shouted orders over the din of battle, moving from position to position, directing fire, adjusting defenses, and coordinating counterattacks. The men followed his commands with unwavering focus, their training and courage guiding each movement. Despite the chaos of the night, every Marine seemed to know his role and execute it with deadly efficiency. They used the terrain to their advantage, the rocks and trenches providing cover, the jungle foliage concealing movements, and the barricades forcing the enemy into predictable paths. Private Daniel Moore fired rapidly from his foxhole, sweat and dirt streaking his face as he tracked the movement of the enemy across the terrain. He could hear the cries and shouts of both friend and foe blending into a cacophony of chaos. His heart pounded in his chest as adrenaline surged through his veins, each second stretching longer than the last. The night was alive with violence and fear. Yet there was a strange clarity in the intensity, each moment demanding complete focus and every action having immediate consequences. Captain Jenkins coordinated with the other officers, reinforcing positions that were under heavy attack and sending squads to counter-flanking maneuvers. The Japanese forces pressed relentlessly, their numbers appearing overwhelming. As they attempted to breach the defensive perimeter, the Marines held their ground, using a combination of firepower and tactical ingenuity, creating choke points and traps that slowed the enemy advance and inflicted significant casualties. The night was punctuated by the screams of men and the thunder of artillery. Every explosion sent clouds of dirt and debris into the air, and every shot demanded immediate reaction. The Marines moved with a fluidity that came from months of preparation and training. Yet the unpredictability of the battle constantly challenged their endurance and resolve. They communicated with hand signals and shouted orders over the gunfire, relying on instinct as much as strategy. Lieutenant Harrison saw a group of enemy soldiers attempting to outflank the southern perimeter. He shouted to the men in the nearest foxholes to adjust their aim and bring suppressing fire onto the advancing troops. Mortars fired overhead, sending plumes of smoke and earth into the darkness, while machine guns raked the path of the enemy, cutting them down before they could reach the trench line. The men fought with a ferocity born of necessity, every shot calculated, every movement deliberate. Private Moore ducked as a grenade exploded near his position, sending dirt and splinters flying. He felt the vibration through the ground and instinctively returned fire at the advancing soldiers. His comrades shouted to each other, giving directions and warnings and lending support. In the chaotic melee, the night became a blur of movement, sound, and action. Every moment a test of endurance and courage, every second a battle for survival. The Japanese forces adapted quickly, using their own knowledge of the terrain and attempting to find weaknesses in the defensive lines. They probed the perimeter, sending small groups to distract the Marines, while larger units attempted to break through in other areas. The Marines countered with careful coordination and decisive firepower, each squad covering another, creating a network of interlocking fields of fire that made direct assault. Deadly Captain Jenkins moved along the line under the cover of smoke and darkness, directing fire and encouraging the men he saw the fear in the eyes of the younger soldiers, and reminded them silently to focus on their training and trust in their comrades. Each man was aware that hesitation or misstep could be fatal, yet the discipline and cohesion of the unit held them together in the face of overwhelming odds. The jungle became a chaotic battlefield, shadows leaping from tree to tree, the sounds of movement and gunfire echoing through the undergrowth. Every step forward was contested, and every advance measured against the cost of human life. The Marines used every tool at their disposal, rifles, pistols, grenades, and improvised weapons, to hold the line against the relentless assault of the Japanese troops. Their courage and determination were tested as waves of enemy. Soldiers attempted to overrun their positions. Lieutenant Harrison noticed a gap forming in the western perimeter and called for reinforcements, sending squads to plug the breach and provide covering fire. The men moved swiftly through the trenches, and underbrush firing as they advanced and throwing grenades to disrupt enemy formations. Each squad relied on the others, trusting that coordinated action would hold the defensive line intact, even as the chaos of battle threatened to overwhelm. Then Private Moore reloaded his weapon as another wave approached his foxhole. He glanced at the men beside him, noting their tense expressions and clenched jaws. All of them shared the same silent understanding that their survival depended on the strength of their unit and the courage of each individual. The night pressed on with no sign of reprieve, each encounter draining energy and testing endurance. Yet the Marines continued to fight with relentless determination. The Japanese forces attempted to exploit every weakness using coordinated flanking maneuvers and sudden rushes. The Marines anticipated and countered each tactic with precise fire and well-timed explosives. They set traps in likely approach paths, dug additional foxholes, and reinforced barricades, ensuring that any enemy advance would be met with deadly resistance. The jungle echoed with the sound of battle, the cries of men and the explosion of ordnance forming a nightmarish symphony. Captain Jenkins noticed an enemy squad attempting to breach the northern edge of the perimeter. He directed a squad to intercept using the cover of darkness and terrain to their advantage. They moved silently but swiftly, engaging the enemy with sudden bursts of fire and throwing grenades into the advancing soldiers, disrupting their formation and buying precious time for the rest of the defensive line. The men coordinated their efforts seamlessly, responding to the fluid and unpredictable movements of the enemy lieutenant. Harrison moved between positions, checking on the wounded and encouraging those still fighting. He coordinated medical aid while simultaneously directing fire and sending messages to squads under pressure. The battlefield demanded constant awareness and decision-making, every choice carrying the weight of life and death. His mind raced with strategy as he balanced the need to hold positions with the reality of limited resources and mounting casualties. Private Moore felt the exhaustion creeping into his limbs, the constant movement, the heat, the smoke, and the adrenaline taking a toll. Yet he continued to fight, firing at approaching enemy soldiers and responding instantly to the commands of his superiors. Each moment was a struggle between fatigue and the instinct to survive the night, filled with an unrelenting sense of urgency and danger that left no room for distraction or hesitation. The night pressed on, and the battle intensified with every hour. The Marines held their positions, With a combination of skill, courage, and sheer determination, each squad covered the other, relying on coordination and trust to withstand the repeated assaults. The Japanese forces were skilled and relentless, yet they were met with a disciplined and determined defense that refused to yield. Explosions lit up the darkness, intermittently revealing the chaos of battle, the twisted shadows of trees and men moving in desperate action. Every sound was amplified by the jungle, the crack of gunfire, the screams, the thuds of grenades, and the distant rumble of artillery forming an overwhelming sensory storm. Yet through it all, the Marines maintained their focus, each man aware of his role and the importance of every action, Captain Jenkins observed. The battlefield, from a slight elevation, coordinating fire and directing reinforcements where they were needed most. He moved quickly from position to position, giving orders and reassurances, the calm authority in his voice cutting through the chaos. Lieutenant Harrison did the same, moving among the men, providing guidance and support, ensuring that morale and focus remained intact despite the horrors of the night. Private Moore engaged an enemy soldier attempting to climb into his foxhole. He fired quickly and efficiently, taking down the soldier, and immediately returned to scanning the perimeter for other threats. Every second demanded vigilance, every movement could mean survival or death. He felt a strange combination of fear, exhaustion, and determination, knowing that the outcome of the night depended on his actions and the actions of those around him. As the hours dragged on, the intensity of the battle began to ebb and flow, with waves of attack followed by brief lulls. The Marines used these moments to reposition, check ammunition, tend to the wounded, and reinforce weak points. Each man understood that the fight was far from over, that the night still held danger, and that the survival of their unit depended on continued vigilance and courage. Lieutenant Harrison watched the eastern flank and saw the Japanese forces faltering under sustained fire and well-timed counterattacks. The careful preparation and discipline of the Marines had created a situation in which the attackers were suffering heavy losses, every advance met with lethal resistance. The night continued to rage, yet the tide was slowly turning in favor of the determined defenders who refused to give an inch. Private Moore paused briefly to catch his breath and glanced at the men around him, their faces illuminated by occasional flashes of gunfire. Each one bore the marks of exhaustion and strain, yet their determination was unwavering. The bonds of trust and camaraderie forged in the darkness were stronger than fear, each man knowing that together they could endure the night and survive. The Japanese forces attempted one final coordinated assault, using every resource and tactic at their disposal. They surged forward across the battlefield, met with a storm of bullets, grenades, and relentless resistance. The Marines held their ground with courage and skill, every man performing his duty under the most extreme conditions. Each action contributed to the collective effort to repel the overwhelming numbers and preserve the line. Lieutenant Harrison and Captain Jenkins coordinated the final stages of the defense, sending reinforcements to key points and using every available weapon to maintain the integrity of the perimeter. The Japanese forces began to falter, their momentum broken by the sustained and disciplined resistance of the Marines. The night stretched on, but slowly the intensity of the assault diminished, and the men could sense that victory was within reach. Despite the heavy toll and exhaustion, Private Moore fired the last rounds of his magazine into the retreating soldiers, then reloaded quickly, scanning for any remaining threats. His body was battered, and fatigued, his mind alert and focused on survival. Each man knew that the night had tested them beyond anything they had ever imagined, yet their courage and determination had held the line and forced the enemy to retreat. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, the jungle seemed to hold its breath. The echoes of the night-long battle lingered in the air, the ground scarred with craters from explosives and littered with spent cartridges and debris. The once vibrant foliage was trampled and torn, leaving a battlefield marked by the intensity of combat. The U.S. Marines emerged slowly from their foxholes and trenches, their bodies aching muscles, trembling, and faces streaked with sweat dirt and blood, yet their eyes held, the quiet fire of survival. Lieutenant Harrison moved along the line, checking on his men. Each encounter a mixture of relief and sorrow. The men were exhausted and shaken, yet there was a sense of triumph that resonated through the ranks. Despite the chaos of the night, every position had held and the enemy had been repelled. The young soldiers who had entered the night with trepidation now carried the weight of their own resilience and courage, each step a testament to their endurance and determination. Private Daniel Moore leaned against the side of his trench, his rifle resting loosely in his hands. He felt the tremor of exhaustion in his limbs, the soreness of muscles overused, and the tightness of stress finally beginning to ease. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night was fading, leaving only the raw awareness of survival. He looked around at the men near him, their faces showing the same mixture of fatigue and relief. Each had endured horrors that would be remembered long after. The battle yet they had survived together. Captain Jenkins surveyed the battlefield from a slight rise, noting the positions that had been fiercely contested and the areas where the Japanese forces had made their final failed assaults. He nodded, quietly in acknowledgement of the men who had held the line through sheer courage and coordination. The perimeter remained intact despite the overwhelming odds, the careful preparation and the disciplined execution of strategy ensuring that the Marines had withstood a force far superior in numbers. The air was heavy with the scent of gunpowder, and earth mingled with the faint tang of blood. Each step across the battlefield brought the sound of shattered foliage and the clatter of equipment left behind. The men moved deliberately, checking for wounded and securing their positions, ensuring that any lingering threats were neutralized. Their eyes scanned the tree line for signs of remaining enemy forces, while their minds processed the night of relentless violence that had just ended. Lieutenant Harrison knelt beside a young private who had been grazed by a bullet, offering words of reassurance and directing medics to attend to him. The calm presence of leadership carried weight. In these moments of vulnerability and fear, every act of care and coordination contributed to the overall morale and cohesion of the unit. Despite the exhaustion and trauma, the Marines worked systematically ensuring that all were accounted for, and that the integrity of their defense remained unbroken. Private Moore walked slowly among his comrades, helping to distribute water and checking on ammunition and supplies. The camaraderie that had been forged in the darkness of the previous night was evident in their interactions. Silent nods and brief words of encouragement passed between men who had shared the extremity of combat. Their shared experience created a bond stronger than fear, a mutual recognition of courage and survival that transcended rank or position. The Japanese forces had retreated into the shadows of the jungle, leaving behind the remnants of their failed assault. The Marines cautiously advanced, securing areas that had been contested, ensuring that no ambushes or hidden threats remained. The landscape bore the scars of violence, the earth churned by explosions, and the trees stripped of leaves and branches, a stark testament to the ferocity of the night battle. Yet the lines held firm, and the men had endured. Despite the odds, Captain Jenkins moved along the perimeter, speaking quietly to squads, acknowledging their bravery and issuing instructions for continued vigilance. The night had tested them in every conceivable way, and now the day demanded careful attention to the aftermath, the wounded, and the reorganization of resources. He emphasized the importance of maintaining readiness for potential follow-up attacks while also allowing the men a moment to rest and recover from the relentless strain. Lieutenant Harrison observed the horizon, noting the way the light revealed the extent of the battle. The jungle seemed to breathe again, as if exhaling after a long struggle. Yet the scars remained and would serve as a reminder of the cost of survival. Man in the unit bore personal marks of the night, a combination of fatigue, pain, and pride, yet collectively they had achieved something remarkable, their resilience and courage allowing them to repel a vastly superior force. Private Moore sat briefly, on the edge of a trench, looking out over the battlefield. He thought of the friends who had fallen, the ones who would not rise with the dawn, and the others who had survived alongside him. The sense of shared endurance was overwhelming, a recognition of the human capacity to endure extreme adversity and still emerge with determination intact. The battle was over, yet its lessons would echo in their minds for the rest of their lives, shaping their understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the bonds formed in the crucible of combat. The medics moved swiftly, attending to the wounded, administering aid, and organizing evacuation for those requiring further treatment. The men worked tirelessly, their skill and calm efficiency a vital element in the continued survival of the unit. Each act of care contributed to the overall strength of the Marines, reinforcing the cohesion and morale that had been tested throughout the night. Every life preserved was a testament to the resilience and dedication of the unit as a whole. Captain Jenkins gathered the lieutenants and key non-commissioned officers, discussing the outcome of the engagement, the positions that had held, and the strategies that had proven effective. The lessons of the night would inform future actions, and training emphasizing the importance of preparation, discipline, and coordination. The leadership acknowledged both the successes and the losses, ensuring that each man understood the significance of their role in the larger effort. Lieutenant Harrison walked among the men, distributing words of encouragement and listening to accounts of individual acts of bravery. The stories were shared quietly and with respect, each man aware of the courage and determination displayed by his comrades. The shared narrative reinforced the bonds of the unit and reminded everyone that their collective effort had turned the tide. Despite overwhelming odds, Private Moore helped a comrade adjust his gear, noticing the dirt and blood that marked their clothing, the signs of the battle etched into every movement. He felt a deep respect for the men around him, recognizing the extraordinary endurance and courage that had carried them through the night. The jungle now seemed quieter yet. The memory of the violence lingered as a shadow over the land, a silent acknowledgement of what had been endured and survived. The morning sun illuminated the island, revealing the full extent of the night battle. The defensive lines remained intact. The enemy had been repelled, and the Marines had survived despite being outnumbered. The men began the slow process of cleaning weapons, tending to injuries, and organizing the aftermath. The practical tasks grounding them after the intensity of the previous hours, each action a step toward recovery and understanding the magnitude of their achievement. Captain Jenkins and Lieutenant Harrison coordinated with higher command, sending reports of the engagement detailing the strength and casualties of the enemy, the effectiveness of their own strategies, and the resilience of their men. The communication was meticulous, ensuring that the broader operational picture reflected the reality on the ground, and that recognition and support would be directed appropriately. Private Moore took a moment to reflect on the night, the chaos, the fear, the courage, and the ultimate survival. He understood that the events would be remembered not just as a military engagement, but as a testament to the human capacity to endure adversity and to fight with determination against overwhelming odds. The night had tested them physically, emotionally, and mentally, yet they had emerged with their unit intact and their courage proven. As the day continued, the men began to move with more purpose, cleaning fortifications, checking supply lines, and preparing for the possibility of further action. Their bodies were fatigued, yet their minds sharpened by the clarity of survival and the knowledge of what they had endured. The dawn brought light, but also reflection, the chance to process the intensity of the previous hours and to acknowledge the cost and significance of their actions. The island seemed to settle into a tentative calm, the echoes of battle fading, yet the marks of the struggle visible in every scarred tree and trampled path. The Marines stood together, surveying their achievement, aware of the extraordinary endurance and courage that had carried them through the night. The history of the engagement would be remembered not only for the tactical significance, but for the remarkable resilience and determination displayed by the men who had held their ground against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Harrison and Captain Jenkins moved along the line one final time, taking note of the condition of the men and positions, offering words of encouragement and assurance. Their leadership had been tested and had proven vital in maintaining cohesion and morale through the night. Their presence and guidance had been instrumental in the survival and effectiveness of the unit and in the successful defense of the island. Private Moore looked around at the faces of the men who had survived the night together, a quiet pride settling over him. Their shared experience had forged a bond that would last far beyond the battle and beyond the island itself. The night had been a crucible of fear, courage, and endurance, yet they had emerged with their lives and their unit intact, a testament to human resilience and the extraordinary capacity to face the unimaginable and survive. The morning stretched on the island, bathed in light and quiet as the men tended to the aftermath. The battle was over, yet its legacy remained in the landscape, in the bodies and in the minds of those who had endured it. Each Marine carried with him the memory of the night, the lessons learned, and the understanding of the extraordinary strength found in courage and solidarity. The island had tested them, and they had endured their determination and resilience, marking the beginning of a story that would echo through history as a testament to survival and heroism.